They drop you at a place that's already a story. The pilot circled twice, a gray speck carving wind over a patchwork of spruce and frozen black water, and said over the headset, "You got 1 hour to unload in case weather turns." Then the bush plane touched the little strip and left, the prop wash swallowing the air like a mouth closing. I stood on a snowbank with my duffel and watched the plane shrink and then vanish into the sky. I remember the first sound after it left, the cabin door complaining in the wind, wood on wood, the sound that tells you the world has been locked behind you. The last thing the pilot does before he climbs back in is point to the cabin and nod. He does not linger. The nod looks like a warning. It was late October when they sent me. The company had a job for me, a seasonal systems check, a rewire, and a winterize the generator before the snowfall closed the trail. The cabin is 2 miles off a bush road, reachable only by that thin gravel runway or by sled a long way in. The idea of off-grid in Alaska is literal. No power grid, no cell towers you can count on, and supplies that come via bush plane or snow machine. Bush pilots are the only lifeline. They schedule flights by weather windows and by load. If the window closes, you're on your own. When you're sent to a remote cabin, the first thing you do is check the exits. The second is check the heat source. Both can fail. The cabin was older than the pilot's smile suggested. Log built, a sag to the south wall, stained with decades of smoke. Inside, the stove sat like a purring animal at the center, black iron and ancient soot. There were 2 bunks, a table with a chessboard carved into it, a rusted kerosene lamp, and a mess of tinned food with a past best date from a few winters ago. The place smelled like layered fires and old wool. There was a stack of split wood under a tarp and a spare propane cylinder, the usual piecemeal of survival. I did my job first. Check the generator, test the shore battery bank, clean the carb on the old outboard water supply motor, look over the wiring. Nothing exotic. Everything that could be unsafe was plausible. A cracked flue, an overloaded extension cord, a kerosene lamp left too close to a curtain. In cabins like this, the most normal things kill you slowly and politely. Carbon monoxide from a failing wood or kerosene heater is a real hazard, invisible, odorless, and the kind of thing that turns a man into a sleeping child. In Alaska, CO incidents happen every year in winter because enclosed cabins and stoves can accumulate fumes if venting is blocked or devices misused. If you live in the bush, you respect ventilation like religion. A single clogged flue will not announce its attack. It will steady you into complacency and then take the breath out of you. I lit the stove and set the generator to cycle. The old thing turned over with a cough and a hard little boom. The stove warmed up slow and then satisfied. That purr is a trust you can bank a week on. I stacked wood, checked for drafts, and when I took a breath in the small kitchen, the air tasted like every winter I had ever had. Smoke and metal and a hint of grease. I slept in the top bunk, the one that sagged in the middle a little. The kind carpenters build with love and then forget. The first night was ordinary, in a bush cabin way. The moon threw long angles through the shutters, the wind rifled the needles in the spruce, a fox called in the valley. I thought safe. I thought this is work, not a horror film. And then, at 02:14, I woke because the radio squawked. I had the little emergency VHF parked by the cooker, a requirement. It clicked like a metronome and then made a single perfect tone I had never heard before. The squawk was a single burst, not a call, not a transmission, a tone, the kind old men would say is a jitter on the band. I flipped channels, nothing. HF sounded clean. The satellite phone in its plastic box was dead, no bars. The cloud cover was thick. The aurora was absent. I chalked it up to a local burst, a plane, a generator, and went back to sleep. Appliances fail late at night because that's when the hidden things prefer to speak. The second morning started to unlayer the ordinary into something else. The cabin's trail, a faint ribbon threaded through birch and alder, had a second set of prints beside mine. A single track, not a pair, as if someone had walked with a cane or an odd foot. They were older than mine, but fresher than the snow. At first, I thought animal, maybe a lynx, but the stride was too regular, and the boot impression had a square heel that was not animal at all.
A single human print in a place you know to be undisturbed is like a spoken name in an empty room. I set a small camera outside and wired it to a cheap motion sensor I'd packed. The camera recorded the night while I did a generator rundown. When I reviewed footage, the clip froze my stomach the way hot metal does to bare skin. The feed showed nothing for 3 hours, and then at 0112, a shadow moved across the frame. Not a human silhouette, a slow slide, like a coat pulled across the lens, the kind of motion the wind makes when it moves something, except there was no wind at that hour. The timestamp synced to my VHF squawk time. Cameras that catch a smear when the wind is dead make you trust your instruments and distrust your senses. I began to notice small wrongnesses that stacked like the boards in the cabin's floor. The radio connectors would be 1 pin off when I came back from the woodpile. A mug moved an inch. The chess pieces were rearranged, though the board had been exactly how I'd left it. The stove's draft would cough in a rhythm that matched the old barn's siding if someone kicked it. Little things, the kinds of things you explain away when you're alone. I checked the flue with a mirror, clear. I put a CO detector in the bunk. It read fine. The generator noise signature looked normal, yet at night, the sound outside the cabin changed, as if someone were learning to walk there. Step, pause, slide. Step, pause, slide. Not dog, not moose. The cadence sat just off human, but also not animal. It was the kind of noise you hear when you are half awake and your brain is making wrong connections. Wrongness is a slow thing. It eats the small certainties first. I'm a mechanic by trade and a wayfarer by habit. The language I trust is instrument and checklist, so I wrote everything down. Times, temperatures, radio ticks, camera timestamps. The pattern I began to see was not random. The VHF tone recurred roughly every 36 hours. When it did, the dreams I had were the same. I'd be at the window watching the spruce and feel like a hand had taken hold of my elbow. I woke with the taste of copper in my mouth and the feeling I'd been listening to something below the floor. That must sound poetic, but the science is boring and practical. Geomagnetic activity can interrupt satellite phones, GPS, and HF in the high latitudes. Intense auroral activity can degrade comms and make instruments misbehave for short windows. Northern lights and geomagnetic storms can do weird things to electronics. Engineers see timing jitter, dropped packets, and dead satellite modes when storms pass. So when the sat phone blinked dead the night of the first tone, I made a note to check space weather later, a testable, boring thing that gave me the illusion of control. The sky can be an accomplice, and engineers call that useful vocabulary. But there were things the sky could not make. The food tin I'd left on the shelf with a dent the size of a fingernail. The dent was fresh and shallow, as if someone had tapped it with a coin. I have a good memory for small shapes. I rolled the tin in my hands. The dent was not from falling or pressure. It looked like a deliberate, careful tap. I put the tin in my pack and walked the perimeter. The woods were mercifully normal. Birch bark, frost, the hunched shape of the spruce. No tracks near the cabin. For a while, I thought I was misremembering what I'd left.
The human mind is a museum of small errors. But later, when the motion camera picked up a slow smear at 0207 and the CO reading flickered for a single minute, I stopped laughing at the idea of ghosts and started checking my vents again with a sober hand. 1 minute of CO fluctuation is not enough to kill. It's enough to remind you the cabin is a small place with small safety margins. I am not a man who believes in dramatic supernatural things, and yet the wilderness will teach you quickly that a man's confidence in rationality is a fragile podium to stand on. The task list grows heavy when your sleep is thin. I put locks on the inside of the door, a simple hasp and a padlock, and I patched a second, cheap camera above the stove, facing the entry. For 2 nights, the cabin was quiet. On the 3rd night, the lock was latched from the outside. Finding a lock latched from the outside is a particular kind of dread. It tells you that someone else is in the world who knows your routine.
I did not sleep after that. I packed a bag and sat on the bed with the padlock on my lap and my teeth tasting like metal. The radio chirped a tone at 0214, the same hour, and suddenly every hair in my body was alert. I stood slowly, palms flat to the old table, and walked to the shutter. The sky was a smear of cloud. Nothing moved but a faint green along the horizon, not bright enough to be aurora, but enough to make the northern night strange. I opened the door a sliver and looked out. Tracks led off into the spruce. One set was fresh and going away from the cabin. Another set, fainter, came toward the cabin and stopped in front of the porch, right where the padlock had been. The soil had been disturbed, and there, in the soft packed snow, was that single boot mark again, square heel, a pattern I couldn't place. It led away, as if the person had walked deliberately to the porch, touched the lock, and left. The neatness of a step in the snow is like a signature. I called the Bush Plane Company on the VHF again. Nothing. The sat phone blinked once and died. The battery meter on my handheld piped a single tone and fell in percent for a breath. Electronics have moods. Sometimes the cold saps them. Sometimes storms bruise them. Sometimes things nobody bothers to write about in manuals tamp them, like someone laying a cold hand. I tried the analog emergency beacon, the one that pings with an old-school tone to a relay, and it clicked on, but returned only static, like a radio in a basement. Gear fails. It's what gear does. It's the timing that becomes the story. The next morning, a bush pilot did return, later than scheduled, apologetic about wind, and he took one look at my face and said, "You all right, boss?" He didn't sound like he was asking. The men who fly the bush know things about leaving places. They can sense the weight of a cabin on a man's shoulders. I told him the generator issues and the strange radio ticks and the lipped padlock. He loaded my empty propane and left me a thermos. He didn't say anything about Prince. When he cleared his throat and said, "We don't really like that ridge up there. No one does," I asked, "What do you mean, ridge?" And he said, "The trees. They've been whispering around that cabin since '98. Old man Jenkins didn't last a winter in there." He spat and shook his head, and then said, "You want to come out? We can get you to the station. Pilots don't scare easily." That was the most useful sentence. Leave if you need to. A bush pilot's caution is more valuable than a dozen internet articles. I did not leave. I packed a bag and burned a cigarette in the sink and listened to the dramatic self-talk that wants to convince you bravery is virtue. The pilots circled and left. I sat on the floor with the thermos and the generator's hum and thought of Jenkins as a man with bad luck or a cautionary tale. I thought about reports from the lodge about hunters missing and the way small communities smear stories into lore. Maybe it was all that. Maybe the prints were a trap, but I am never content to shrug at patterns. I wired the cam to a battery backup and then sat with a pen and started to write. Times, actions, the thing called a log. Men write logs to keep their minds honest. The act of writing is a small anchor when the world tilts. The thing you should know: the bush is honest in an ugly way. If you respect it, it feeds you. If you mistreat it, it punishes slowly. If it wants you gone, it arranges storms and mechanical failures. But whatever the bush is, it doesn't usually make the furniture move in the middle of the night. Whoever or whatever latches a padlock from the outside and taps a tin with a small coin had the patience of a surgeon. They knew my schedule. They knew how long before a man would check the generator. They knew how to make the radio chirp at 0214. Later that night, I heard a sound that didn't fit any category I liked. Not a human whisper, not an animal call, not wind. It was a soft tapping that started in the ceiling and worked its way down through the joists like someone walking across the attic with half their shoes off. It paused above my head, and then, once, something ran a fingertip across the underside of the roof in a slow, searching line. Then silence. My palms perspired. I hope you never stand in a log cabin at 0317 and feel like the house is listening back at you. Listening is an active thing. Sometimes the house answers.
I checked the flue one more time. It was clear. The CO meter read green. The camera batteries were full. The padlock sat on the hook inside, yet I could not sleep. I sat and wrote. I wrote the times and the small wrong things. I wrote down the pilot's nod and the way the thermos had steamed in the morning light. I wrote that I'd seen a print and that the camera had caught a smear at 0112 and that the stove sometimes coughed like it was being moved by someone's hand. Then the generator died. Not a sputter, not a dying sound. It dropped, dead. The lights went to silence. The clock blinked. The only sound left was that slow tapping, far beyond the wall now, in a place like the water under the ice, patient and wet. Power failure at night in a remote cabin forces you to choose. Stay and listen with the dark, or go out into the trees where the world is a stranger. I grabbed the flashlight and the gun I had, a small shotgun the pilot insisted I keep, and opened the door. The wind threw a blast of air into my face that smelled faintly of old wood and something else, like tin. The tracks were gone. The snow was clean, as if nothing had passed. But there, scrawled in the snow on the porch, was something I did not recognize. A small ring, about the size of a dinner plate, drawn with tiny footprints like a wheel. It was too neat for any animal. I knelt down and felt the cold, and saw that the ring had impressions on the inside, like small shoe bottoms placed in a gentle spiral. A symbol drawn in the snow is a language. You do not want to be fluent in it. I will end section 1 here, because the worst part of these stories is the moment you must make a decision you cannot unmake. Do you leave and risk the pilot's wrath for false alarm? Do you stay and learn who is pacing around your roof? Do you try to force the door open at 2 a.m. to catch a thief, or a neighbor, or a thing that doesn't name itself? My log ends section 1 with a small, ugly choice. I closed the door, latched the padlock inside, turned the little radio to channel 16 for listening, and sat under the stove's last warmth with the gun across my lap. I listened until the tapping stopped. The last sound I remember before sleep took me, an uneasy, thin sleep, was something small and patient, the sound of someone walking away in measured, careful steps. The bush has rules. The pilot's nod was one. The cabin's flue was another. The new one I learned that night was this: if you are sent to a remote cabin and things aren't right, leave a mark you can recognize, because the thing that learns your pattern will copy it and then use it against you.
When I scrubbed the camera a second time, the smear sharpened into something that tipped his head and looked straight at the lens. Then the image folded like paper and the feed went black. Not the tiniest smear in the motion cam. The second camera I stuck above the stove, the one over the threshold. It was a cheap camera, wired to a battery backup and taped into a hard boot drive. When I played the clip back frame by frame, something very precise happened. A gap of hours, then a figure passes the frame in slow motion, almost like someone editing their own movement for effect. In one frame, you could see a hand pressed to the door jamb. Not a glove, not a mitten, a bare hand with a pale ring on the finger like ceramic or frost. In the next frame, the door was latched. In the following frame, the indoor light blinked once, exactly one blink. A single blink on an interior light is the punctuation mark of an intelligence. The footage was grainy and small, and yet it had composition, intentionality. Whoever or whatever moved had knowledge of where the camera was and how a camera sees. That knowledge is not primitive.
You don't stumble into a view on camera and make a tidy silhouette unless you want to be seen and also not seen. I watched the clip 3 times, then I played it to the recorder and froze the frame at the hand. The ring on the finger was not metal. It caught no specular highlight. It looked like bone or glazed ceramic, something that had been weathered. I thought of Jenkins's name, the pilot had said, and felt the old knot fishermen talk about. The human shape that keeps a rime on its hair and a dry grin for the foolish. Human artifacts in the frame make your world smaller. I left the drive in my locker and walked to the ridge the pilot had warned about. The ridge is not high. In a place like that, ridge can be an anomalous rise in tree line and soil, but the trees leaned there as if listening to the wind more than usual. I followed game trails and old fox prints. At one time, a wooden stake, a thin stick driven into the snow, bore a strip of red cloth. It was faded and frayed. No one flagged the place for the pilot. I'd not seen such a marker on the way in. The red, in the gray day, looked like a heart someone had hung there and forgotten. I walked until the weather shifted. On my way back, the motion camera on the porch tripped. The recorded clip showed a figure moving at the edge of the light, not close enough to see detail, but close enough to hear my breath when I replayed it with headphones. The soundtrack caught 2 things I had not noticed before: a soft scraping like someone's fingernails on a metal surface, and beneath it, a thin, low-frequency humming, a harmonic that an animal didn't make. I thought of power lines and transformers and old small machines. There's an uncanny signature to things that hum. They are not alive in any clean sense, and yet you fear them more because they sound deliberately awake. The hum is a metronome someone else keeps. That afternoon, a neighbor came. Neighbors in the bush are economies of favor and caution. He drove in on a snow machine, the jam of his pack rat trailer trailing tracks. He introduced himself as Leo, a man with a slow speech, as someone who spends a lot of time with long winters and fewer strangers. He did not smile first. He measured me like wood before stacking it. "You the one in Jenkins' cabin?" he asked. "Yes," I said. He dismounted his machine and left the engine idling. He smelled of diesel and smoked salmon. He did not ask about tools. He asked, "Have you seen anything off?" I told him what I'd seen. His hands worked the strap on the sledge like a man steadying a boat. He looked at the porch camera and said, "That ring on the snow? Circle maker. Old-time thing. Folks used to put circles for traps and for rights, but the way you say it, single boot, that ain't a trap. That's a signature. When a local gives you a word for a pattern, it becomes history." He told me about Jenkins, a name that felt like a lint bad luck. Jenkins had been a loner, said Leo, someone who liked bottles of black tea and too much time by the fish stream. One winter, he locked himself up and run out of oil, and the pilot found him gone and the cabin sketched with a circle of little prints. People thought he'd walked off into the snow. They assumed animal or accident. Folks whispered different things about strange visitors, about people who come in single steps. Leo said the ridge was a place men avoided finally now. Something about the trees speaking long and thin, and men getting the ears for it. He did not say more, and when I asked, he changed the subject to propane. The thing people refuse to name is often the one they fear most.
That night, my camera caught better footage. Not a smear now. The figure stood at the edge of LED halo, just beyond the porch light. It did not move when my lens found it. For a long second, it seemed to be listening. The figure's form was tall and thin, asymmetrical, one shoulder higher than the other, and when it looked up, it did so with a slow, small tilt that matched the tilt in the first camera's frozen hand frame. The figure put a hand to the door and did not touch the latch. It withdrew. Refusal to touch is a practiced courtesy, and practice implies rules. I slept poorly that night, in a way that was mechanical. The clock beeped, and I cross-checked battery, CO, and the flue every 2 hours. Dawn came, and the thaw left the snow like blotting paper. The single boot track had been softened, erased in places. In the porch snow, someone had placed a tiny paper square, a folded scrap of newspaper, yellowed,
with a line of text written in a skinny marker. I unfolded it with a gloved hand and read 3 words: "We are watching." There are moments when your body tries to reject language. Those 3 words sat like a cold coin. Someone had been close enough to the porch to leave a message and not make a noise. The timing, after midnight and before dawn, when I had been awake and listening, suggested a patience I did not like. Leo would later tell me that the old folks used to write warnings on scraps when the wolves came in a bad year. But this scrap had the neatness of a human hand with purpose, not the messy scrawl of a startled neighbor. Human handwriting in the snow is not an accident, it's a conversation. I called the pilot on the VHF. He came around mid-afternoon, quicker than before. He looked at the scrap, rubbed his chin, and said nothing for a long minute. Then he said, "2 choices. You can pack it up now and come out with me, or you can stay and keep records and we send someone with you later. If it's dangerous, you shouldn't be alone." He used the word "we." That small plural told me the station knew things and that the station also had priests for secrecy. I chose the second option for reasons that are easy to name and harder to feel: curiosity, arrogance, work ethic. I told the pilot over coffee I'd stay. He tapped the table with his finger and pushed a small slab of metal across the cup, an emergency locator button, old model, and told me its battery life. He said, "If you push this, it calls us and it tells us where you are. Use it if you are in danger." He put his hand on the radio and said quietly, "And keep the drives in your pocket." That "and" was a weight. It meant keep evidence near you. Sometimes professionals give you real tools. Sometimes they give you a confession. That night, we tried to bait the visitor. I am ashamed to say that in the spirit of scientific procedure, we left the kitchen light on and set a motion sensor camera in the window and taped a cheap reflector to the porch step. We put an empty can on the table and left a little pile of coffee grounds where someone might idly play with them. It felt childish, but practical. If someone intended to make noise, they would touch something. The motion camera tripped at 0109. The footage showed the person approach, hesitate, and then do something I did not expect. The figure stood facing the rafters for a long minute, arms folded, and seemed to be listening to the inside wood. The figure then produced a small, slow exhale, visible vapor in the freezing air, and lowered its head. For a moment, it turned its face toward the lens, and I saw something uglier than a face, a split, pale surface where an eye would be, and then, to my nausea, a second fold where a mouth should sit. Not a mouth for eating, but a ringed aperture like the rim of a hole. The figure did not scream. It simply withdrew. A face that does not want to be human is a contract the mind cannot sign.
The film is the sort of evidence people in offices will tear to shreds. Low resolution, grainy, open to artifacts. But the motion cam was not the only witness that night. The porch sensor, a cheap pressure mat, recorded 3 small weight increases: 12 kilograms, 18 kilograms, 15 kilograms. Numbers too low for a human adult and too high for a coyote or fox. Whoever had stepped on was not walking the way we know. The padlock, latched inside, had been moved. Staple deformation suggested force from inside the shank, not a pry from outside. The padlock had been latched from the outside before, then secured inside. Someone had ways of crossing the threshold and leaving it as if nothing had happened. The math of weight can be kinder than the fiction of fear. I called Leo in and showed him the frames. He stared and slowly rubbed the side of his mouth with his hand. There's a story about a man found up the ridge. He used to keep glass in the walls, small rounds that looked like eyes, he said.
Folk put them there to remember your breath. Old Jenkins had a box of them. They called them watchin' stones. He glanced at me like folklore was a litany of truth. Then he asked in the sort of voice that asks you to be careful even with miracles, "Did you see the ring in the snow with the boot prints in neat circles?" I told him about the ring. He swallowed. "Don't keep showing at the porch. Don't rot your name in the snow. They learn quick how a man walks." He lifted a finger as if to touch my forehead. "Things around the ridge got protective. Might be family, might be habit, might be something else. Don't get them to like you." People with long winters learned that advice is also a currency. That night, I made a different choice. I closed all the shutters. I wrapped my camera drive in foil and stuffed it into my jacket under a sweater. I left the emergency beacon on the table with a hand on it. I took the shotgun and went into the small attic above the bunks with a wrench and a flashlight. There is a part of me that thinks going up into an attic is masculine theater. Another part thinks it is necessary. The attic was shallow, and it smelled of insulation and old cedar. In the center was a floorboard that had a notch, a hatch. I pried it up. Under the hatch was a crawl space, about the size of a man curled in sleep. There were small artifacts, a coil of twine, a paper wrapper folded in halves, a human tooth in a small tin, and a scrap of newspaper dated 1997 with a single name printed in pencil, Jenkins, and a crude drawing of a ringed pattern. The scrap had been kept dry in grease, and it smelled like someone's pocket. I put my flashlight on the tooth, and the light caught a line of dirt that looked like a scrawl. Under the scrap, I found a second thing, a small hand-carved wooden token, blackened at one edge like scorched wood, with a tiny hollow in the center rim where something, a bead, might have been seated. The attic holds the things men hide from each other. Sometimes those things are warnings. I sat with those items and felt the room hollow out. My rationalist brain ticked through possible explanations. Local squatter, prank, a family of hunters using the attic as a secret store. But the things did not match a transient. The tooth was old, worn, and the token looked like it had been used as a handle. The scrap had Jenkins's name, and Campbell's handwriting in the station register had that exact scrawl a year after he disappeared. Found items make history sit on your knee. It is heavy. When I climbed down the ladder and closed the hatch, the house sounded different, not in volume, but in relation. The stove hummed in a way that indicated a slight change in draft. The wood creaked in the pattern of someone marking a page. I opened the door slowly, and the porch was empty. Snow had drifted and smoothed things. But at the south end of the porch, under a plank where the sun rarely touched, someone had scrawled another scrap, "Leave a sign." It was not a threat, it was an instruction. Instructions are kinder than threats in their bluntness. I dug a shallow pit in the snow and wrote my name in a notebook in block letters, full name, date, time, and buried it with a small stone. Then I stood in the porch light and waited. At 01:14, the radio made its single tone, and the piano string hum that had accompanied the first nights rose from the ridge and folded down like a welcome. The movement in the trees was a slow one, a drifting of branches that sounded almost like breathing. And then I saw it, a figure stepping into the ring I'd made.
It walked as though following water, slow, gentle, deliberate. It did not rush to the porch. It walked around the circle twice, then stopped, then traced the pattern of my name with a single finger on the snow, as if trying to copy letter forms. It was then that I understood. The thing was not only watching, it was learning. Learning is the worst thing curiosity can teach a hunter. I did not wait for a fight. I did not shout. I backed inside, latched the door, and pushed the beacon. The pilot's voice came through the VHF a minute later, close and fast. He and Leo arrived with a pair of men, lights sweeping, snowshoes moving like the planet's own camouflage. The ring in the snow had been smoothed over by wind. The place where I'd buried my note had a faint depressional outline, but the snow had been smoothed. They asked what I wanted to do. I wanted to go home, plain and unvarnished. They offered to take me that night. The pilot said the station would get a crew out first thing in the morning to inspect the attic and to retrieve the artifacts. He said, "We'll log it. We'll bring in folks." I said, "Can I take the drive?" He looked at me long and then said, "No." He quoted rules. He gave radios. He looked at the sky. He started the machine, and we left. When authorities say no to a question, their face says the rest. Weeks later, I got a short, formal note from the station. No hazardous activity determined. Items recovered for analysis. No further action recommended. They signed it and said I could return to the cabin if I liked. The pilot did not return calls. Leo gave me a look at the post office and then offhand said, "Some things you shouldn't poke at. Folks forget better if you let them. The world will give you a neat report that smells like a bed that has been made by a stranger." I kept one token, not the tooth, not the wooden token. I kept a single frame from the motion camera, the frame where the figure turns its head toward the lens and the ring on its finger catches the porch light like a dull eye. I encrypted the file, burned 2 copies, and mailed one to myself in a padded mailer, so I would know later whether anyone ever found it. I cannot say why I kept it, except that people who survive leave marks. Sometimes those marks are warnings, and sometimes they are instructions for the next person who doesn't leave. The next winter, I saw the cabin's roof from a plane, and it looked ordinary as any roof. But when you know a thing has learned you, ordinary is only a stage before rehearsal.